and also from Dr. Anthony Fauci, Director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases.
Good morning. And to those of you who do not work here, a warm welcome to the Pan American Health Organization. I am Lydia Bond, the organization's regional advisor on AIDS health promotion. Interpretation is available in Spanish on channel 1, 2, and in English in channel 1 for those of you who need it. You all have received a copy of today's program, inside of which you will find a registration form. For our record, we would appreciate you filling out the form and either handing it to a member of the AIDS staff who are walking around, or please dropping it into one of the boxes especially marked outside of this conference room. Our focus today is on AIDS, the devastating worldwide disease whose existence was first recognized as this decade began and which, sadly, is still with us as it ends. Next to malaria, AIDS is the greatest infectious disease threat to the health of the world's people today. Disraeli, a British Prime Minister of the 19th century, once said that all the powers and happiness of the state rests on the health of its people. AIDS has so threatened this health that 2 years ago, at the London Summit of Ministers of Health, delegates from over 140 nations unanimously pledged their commitment to join in the fight against the disease, a resolution that culminated in the decision to celebrate World AIDS Day on December 1. Among the various ministerial declarations, that of the Ministers of Health of Central America and Panama stood out. It called on its people to participate actively and permanently in the prevention of the HIV transmission by avoiding sexual relations with more than one regular partner and by using condoms during sexual intercourse. It also encouraged the other ministries, particularly the ministries of education, as well as governmental and non-governmental organizations, to work jointly with the health sector in implementing AIDS prevention measures. Today, around the world, governmental and non-governmental organizations, community-based groups, and many others have put together spectacular events to commemorate World AIDS Day. The activities prepared range from community-arranged group discussions in remote rural areas to mass demonstrations in large urban ones. Candlelit marches, releasing of black and white balloons in the sky to remember those who have died of AIDS, display of the Names Project quilt in major cities, national television, radio, and newspaper broadcasts on AIDS, free distribution of AIDS information pamphlets and condoms in public parks, sports stadiums, subway stations, and important thoroughfares are but a few of the activities displayed today. Youth have been particularly creative and have organized rock festivals, musical productions, peer discussions, exhibits, continuous video projections in universities, schools, and health services, and steady support and demonstrations of solidarity to persons with AIDS or the HIV infection. What is highlighted from these activities may be summarized thus. In Mexico, outreach peer education programs. In Peru, cultural activities in public parks. In Chile, joint declarations of university federation presidents and demonstrations of solidarity, tolerance, and understanding of persons with the HIV infection. In Costa Rica, creation of youth organizations for AIDS surveillance. In Paraguay, rock festivals sponsored by the Red Cross. In Colombia, artistic demonstrations, national poster contests, youth workshops on sexuality and AIDS, and special cathedral masses. In Uruguay, fundraising activities consisting of fashion parades, Venezuela, musical programs, and everywhere in the Caribbean, English-speaking and French, songs, folkloric demonstration, theatrical production, and information distribution. We are honored to have with us today several distinguished leaders in the fight against AIDS. To welcome them, I now have the pleasure of presenting Dr. Carla Guerra de Macedo, Director of the Pan American Health Organization. Dr. Macedo has been the Director of the Pan American Sanitary Bureau, Regional Office of the Americas of the World Health Organization since 1983. Dr. Macedo obtained his medical degree from the University of Pernambuco in Recife, Brazil, and his master's degree in public health from the University of Santiago, Chile. A specialist in health planning, population, and economic and social development, Dr. Macedo already had an impressive international career before becoming PAHO director. Among other things, he was a visiting professor at schools of public health in Buenos Aires, Santiago, Medellin, Mexico City, Lima, and in several universities in his native country, Brazil. Dr. Macedo has received numerous awards from universities and ministries of health in Latin America and Caribbean nations, but above all, he's a very dedicated human being who has made the international cause for health promotion his own personal challenge. Dr. Macedo.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bond, Dr. Ali, Dr. Foss, Dr. Osborne, Dr. Delgado, my good friend at this board, Dr. Zacharias, special guests, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to first to welcome all of you and to thank all of you for coming here today to join us in this House of the Health for the Pan American Health Organization to celebrate this day together, to strengthen our feelings of solidarity and our commitment to fight against this disease throughout our region. AIDS is a disease which implies a new challenge for humanity. It is a source of frustration for scientists, pain for the sick and their loved ones, and anxiety for those who are overcome by the fear of the unknown. Its rapid spread and broad impact has left its mark in the social, cultural, and economic and political spheres of all countries without distinction to the level of development. The AIDS epidemic is now widespread in all countries and territories of the Americas. As of November 30th, 1989, a total of 135,079 cases of AIDS have been reported to the Pan American Health Organization since the beginning of surveillance in 1983. Over 80% of these cases have occurred in the United States of America. At this point, we know that the number of persons with AIDS will continue to increase throughout the Americas, independently of any interventions. However, the rate of increase will be influenced markedly by our degree of success in preventing the sexual, parenteral, and perinatal transmission of HIV. Today, most societies have already begun to respond to the challenge of HIV infection. In little more than 2 years, countries have understood that they are faced with a threat which does not respect borders and have consequently united their efforts to combat it through the special program on AIDS of WHO. All countries in the Americas now have programs for the prevention and control of AIDS, with plans of action and funds and resources committed to the struggle against AIDS. Without such immediate action, the spread of HIV and related retrovirus is likely to re-escalate throughout our hemisphere and to have an even more profound impact on the medical, cultural, economic, and political structure of the Americas for at least the next decade. In fact, already during the last 3 years, a rapid change in case distribution has been observed, principally in countries in the Caribbean and Central America, where more and more women are now being infected with the AIDS virus. Today, I shall talk specifically about regional AIDS prevention. Later, Dr. Fernando Zacarias will discuss in more detail the epidemiology of AIDS in the Americas. In the region of the Americas, PAHO executes the Global Program on AIDS, GPA, and coordinates a wide variety of regional activities carried out in support of the development of national AIDS prevention and control programs. This is done through 6 basic strategies: direct technical collaboration, dissemination of information, training, research, international coordination, and mobilization of resources. The regional program of AIDS provides direct technical collaboration to national programs. To date, well over 50 short-term consultants have been mobilized and trained in the last 6 months to address particular problems in AIDS prevention and control. Special teams have been sent to countries to evaluate national programs, to help implement specific activities and programs, and program the transition between short and long-term approaches, and to contribute to the development of financial strategies for funding these programs. Specific expertise has been provided to solve special problems. The regional program also disseminates technical and scientific information to national AIDS prevention and control programs through the PAHO epidemiological bulletin, articles in journals, and presentation at scientific meetings, as well as through the production of manuals and norms about AIDS prevention. Some special initiatives include the establishment of 3 information, education, communication centers in region, Brazil, in Mexico, Brazil, and at PAHO's Caribbean Epidemiological Center, CAREC, in Trinidad and Tobago, to collect, evaluate, and disseminate AIDS information and education materials from as many countries as possible to other member countries, to assist them in formulating their national education efforts. Scientific information is also distributed to the national programs using compact disc technology. PAHO continued to utilize innovative technology to promote AIDS education through the broadcast from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, of the second Pan-American Teleconference on AIDS in December 1988. This teleconference reached over 41,000 healthcare workers throughout the Americas, and for the first time was broadcast outside the region to Portugal, Kuwait, and 5 African countries. The training strategy served to organize numerous workshops on health promotion, counseling, media sensitization, nurses' involvement, and AIDS cases and other areas with the participation of personnel from all countries in the Americas. Through the research strategy and the special contract with the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease of the National Institutes of Health, United States, PAHO has established research programs on AIDS in several countries. PAHO is now seeking to extend its research activities beyond the biomedical sphere to include a major project on sexual behavior research. The strategy of international coordination has enabled PAHO to organize quarterly meetings attended by well over 40 representatives from various international and national agencies and institutions to coordinate support to PAHO's member countries for AIDS prevention and control. Finally, through the strategy of mobilization of resources, PAHO, with the collaboration of the GPA, Global Program on AIDS, has secured so far funding for the countries from WHO and other donors in the amount of more than $12 million since the beginning of the program. These funds have been distributed to 35 countries and PAHO's Caribbean Epidemiological Center during the period 1987-1989. During the same period, 89% of these funds was distributed directly to the countries. In the last 8 years, we have learned a great deal about AIDS. We have a better idea of the structure of immunopathogenesis of the HIV, and also we still do not understand the complexity of sexual behavior. We know that individual and societal changes are possible to avoid HIV transmission, provided that we succeed in our educational efforts. Nevertheless, the AIDS situation is bound to worsen before it improves, as known by recent projections. How will the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean respond to the challenges? What will be the extent of the AIDS impact in various countries? And how shall we cope with the legal and ethical dilemmas surrounding AIDS prevention? Lessons from the past 2 years have taught us that we need to emphasize primary prevention rather than postponement of that. Given the magnitude of the impact of AIDS in healthcare services and the future burden for caring for an increasing number of AIDS patients, it is obvious that political and financial commitment by each and every country must be maintained in order to deal with the disease and to face the increasing challenge of providing appropriate care for the infected and the sick. We know intuitively that what we do or do not know will have important consequences for the spread of the epidemic during the next 10 to 20 years. Here at PAHO, during the coming years, we are committed to continue to provide technical collaboration for the evaluation and programming of national AIDS prevention and control programs to ensure that they achieve the major objectives of stopping HIV transmission. As I mentioned earlier, all countries now have AIDS programs, and we will concentrate on collaborating in an integrated manner in their implementation. Simultaneously, we will also secure the safety of all blood and blood products utilized by all health services in countries of the region. And last but not least, we will continue to help implement and evaluate health promotion campaigns on the basis of the findings obtained from more vigorously designed studies. But ultimately, the success of the struggle against AIDS resides in the individual. It is the individual who should learn to be responsible to the self, I suppose, children, family members, and friends. It is the individual who must take into account that promiscuity, escapism, and irresponsible nihilism will take their toll in the long run. For all these efforts, we need to mobilize our young, for we are the first to recognize the importance of peer education and support. We need their creativity, their enthusiasm, their imagination, and their courage and dedication to worthy causes if we are to win the war against AIDS. We therefore consider it appropriate that this December 1st World AIDS Day be devoted to the young, since we are certain that their commitment is a guarantee for success. In conclusion, my friends, the time to act is now, together, when there is still the possibility to do so, and when there is still hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Macedo. I am now very pleased to introduce Dr. James Allen, Director of the National AIDS Program Office in the United States Department of Health and Human Services. Dr. Allen received his medical training at Johns Hopkins University and joined the U.S. Public Health Services Commissioned Officer Corps in 1972 as a medical epidemiologist attached to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. In 1984, he received his first assignment in CDC's rapidly expanding AIDS program, and thereafter he rose quickly. Earlier this year, he's transferred from Atlanta to Washington to become director of the National AIDS Program Office, and as such, he is a person responsible for coordinating the U.S. government's varied AIDS activity. Dr. Allen, if you will please come to the podium, the sound does not come through otherwise.
Thank you, Dr. Bond. Dr. Guerrero, Dr. Macedo, distinguished guests and colleagues. Both Dr. Louis Sullivan, the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, and Dr. James Mason, the Assistant Secretary for Health, have asked me to convey their personal regrets for being unable to attend today's ceremonies. When they asked me to participate on their behalf, I was personally delighted, and I have looked forward to sharing some national perspectives on the AIDS epidemic as we mark World AIDS Day. We are closing the decade of the 1980s in a few weeks, and we will begin the decade of the 1990s, the last of this century, and the one that will lead us to the year 2000 and the global goal of health for all. No one among us would have predicted in 1980 that today we would find ourselves in a global battle against a tenacious and surprising enemy. The human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, poses serious threats for the future. We know now that we must view this battle in terms of decades rather than months or years. At the same time, we have made remarkable scientific progress during the past 8 years, and in many ways, we can approach this battle today with cautious optimism. And the AIDS epidemic has provided us with some unusual opportunities to re-examine our human values and to forge new alliances in response to this global problem. As you are well aware, HIV infection and AIDS remain major public health problems here in the United States. From 1981, when the disease AIDS was first described, through October 1989, more than 112,000 AIDS cases have been reported to the Centers for Disease Control. This includes more than 10,000 cases in women and more than 1,900 cases in children less than 13 years of age. More than half the people reported to have AIDS are known to have died. We estimate that in the United States, approximately 1 million people are infected with HIV. Epidemiologic studies show that a large proportion of these people ultimately will become ill and be diagnosed with AIDS. We project that by the year 1992, just 2 years from now, the cumulative number of AIDS cases in our country will be well over 300,000, with more than 200,000 deaths. But the epidemic is not static. Changes continue to occur, both in the nature of the epidemic itself, in our knowledge of the problem, and in approaches to treatment and medical care. All these factors have an impact on prevention practices, healthcare delivery, and other services. More than 60% of the newly diagnosed and reported cases of AIDS are still among homosexual and bisexual men in most areas of our country. But in other areas, such as New York City and northern New Jersey, the majority of cases are among drug users and their sexual partners. We are concerned that the number of newly infected persons is continuing to increase rapidly in these population groups. The explosive increase in the use of crack cocaine in our country has led to an increase of HIV infection among women, often still adolescents, who trade sex for drugs in order to maintain their relatively short-lived crack high. One result of increasing HIV infection among drug users and their sexual partners is the growing number of children born to HIV-infected women. In many areas of New York City and in some cities of northern New Jersey, 2% to 4% of infants are born to HIV-infected mothers. Many of these infants and children will be abandoned or orphaned, and approximately 1/3, an estimated 2,000 children per year, will themselves be infected with HIV and will develop AIDS at some point. HIV infection is also increasing among the homeless in major cities. A report on the homeless, commissioned by the New York City Council and published earlier this year, estimates that 5,000 of New York City's homeless are infected with HIV. The changing nature of the epidemic in the U.S. almost mirrors the epidemic of the Third World, increasingly heterosexual, increasing numbers of the poor, and generally concentrated in large urban centers, with the potential to involve in some way every community and every family in the nation. In our country, the people at highest risk of AIDS are often minorities. They are usually uninsured or underinsured, and they frequently do not have access to or contact with the health and medical care system. Given these changing characteristics of the HIV and AIDS epidemics in the United States, how have we responded? The U.S. Public Health Service and its agencies, the National Institutes of Health, Alcohol, Drug Abuse, and Mental Health Administration, Food and Drug Administration, Centers for Disease Control, Health Resources and Services Administration, and the Indian Health Service have all played a major role in addressing the HIV infection epidemic since it was first identified in 1981. As the severity and scope of the problem have become increasingly evident, resources have been made increasingly available to cope with the many issues raised by the epidemic, but it is not enough. State and local governments generally have complemented the programs of the federal government by assessing the needs of their own populations and assuring that the balance of services that are necessary are available. State and local areas often provide direction and support for primary health care services, for information and education programs, for school health education activities, and for prevention activities, including testing and counseling. The local Department of Health in counties and cities around the country are often a central point for coordination of health and social services to persons with AIDS. Volunteer and community-based organizations have been extremely important components of the fight against HIV infection and AIDS in the United States. In areas such as New York City, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, a large proportion of the social service support activities and education programs have been developed, funded, and conducted by groups such as the Gay Men's Health Crisis, the Shanty Project, and AIDS Project Los Angeles, just to name a few. Without these efforts and these volunteers, the situation would have been much worse than it is today. The private sector in the U.S. also has assumed an increasing part of the burden. According to the U.S. Foundation Center, more than 150 private foundations are funding AIDS programs and have spent a cumulative total of $50 million since 1983. Over $30 million of this sum was awarded in the past 12 months. The programs supported by foundations, in terms of numbers of grants, are largely public health education type programs. As has been emphasized many times in many ways, education for prevention is critical to avoid continuation of this epidemic into the next century. We do know how to prevent new HIV infections, but forging the link between knowledge and sustained action by the individual that leads to avoidance or minimization of risk of infection is our challenge, a challenge to each individual, to parents, and local and national leaders, as well as to the international community. Many other challenges lie ahead. We must improve our ability to reach out in new and novel ways to the so-called hard-to-reach groups, the drug addicted, the homeless, the runaway teenagers, the jobless, the children with HIV infection, and the sick and dying. On a positive note, advancements in treating symptoms of the disease are bringing hope that even if AIDS remains incurable, it may become a manageable illness, such as diabetes is today. In fact, apart from the really frightening economic aspects of this epidemic, the future now looks much more promising than it did even a few short years ago. Our U.S. healthcare system, however, is being sorely tested by this disease. Although federal, state, and local health care systems are collaborating together to provide necessary services, we have much to do. Through a national effort combining basic research, drug and vaccine development, and public education, we believe it is going to be possible to stem the tide of infection. It is not going to be easy, and it's not something the Public Health Service or even the entire federal government can do alone. Everyone is going to have to carry a share of the responsibility and the burden. But as we all know, AIDS is not just a U.S. problem. As PAHO representatives and member states are well aware, AIDS is a significant problem for all countries in the Americas. For a country such as Haiti, this new medical problem is added to other major medical and health problems, many of which are preventable or treatable, but sadly are being ignored because of the social and economic problems that overwhelm the country and the people. For other countries in the Americas, each has its own unique set of problems and difficulties that prevent or inhibit the development of as strong or as dynamic or as effective an approach to AIDS as is necessary. The United States is not the only country in the Americas with a significant problem with drug abuse. We are only the most visible. Those that are happy to sell us drugs that devastate our young people will be equally as happy to sell them to any person in any country who is willing to buy. Unfortunately, we will all pay the price. It will not be easy, but all countries of the Americas, and truly all countries around the world, must work together to solve the problem of and the problems created by drug abuse, just as we must work together to solve the problems created by HIV infection and AIDS. One other problem we also must work on together is to lessen the risk of HIV infection for women and for children. I returned just last night from a conference in Paris on the implications of AIDS for mothers and children. This conference, sponsored jointly by the French government and the Global Program on AIDS of the World Health Organization, and attended by a number of delegates from countries in the Americas, was trying to draw attention to the special needs and problems of HIV infection and AIDS for these population groups by summarizing the known information, highlighting the information that still is needed to attack the problem successfully, and suggesting programs and courses of action that might be implemented. As we look ahead to the work that must be accomplished in the next decade, the problems, the sheer number of cases that are expected, often seem overwhelming, but we are making progress. We must continue to move forward together and in cooperation. Solidarity is critical. I would like to close by urging you to remember that the fight against AIDS must be fought not only against the disease, but against the reaction of many people to it. Fear of and discrimination against people with AIDS or HIV infection, or simply those who are believed to be at risk, has been an enormous problem since the recognition of the first cases. It has resulted in loss of housing and jobs, loss of services to which people are entitled, cancellation of insurance, and the loss of access to care. Worst of all, it has resulted in further loss of human dignity. The United States Senate has passed a landmark piece of legislation in the Americans with Disabilities Act. The President has supported it, but the House of Representatives has yet to act. This legislation is needed, but it cannot solve the problem, nor can it prevent discrimination. Only people, you and me, all of us, can do that. Nowhere is there a more compelling illustration of this than the words of Ryan White, an adolescent boy with hemophilia and with AIDS, when he testified before the President's Commission on the HIV epidemic in 1988, and I quote from him here. "The school board, my teachers, and my principal voted to keep me out of the classroom even after the guidelines were set for fear of someone getting AIDS from me by casual contact. Rumors of sneezing, kissing, tears, sweat, and saliva spreading AIDS caused people to panic. We began a series of court battles for 9 months. Eventually, I won the right to attend school, but the prejudice was still there. Listening to medical facts was not enough. People wanted 100% guarantees. Even though we knew that AIDS was not spread by casual contact, parents of 20 students started their own school. Because of the lack of education on AIDS, discrimination, fear, panic, and lies surrounded me. I became the target of Ryan White jokes. Lies were spread about me biting people, spitting on food, and urinating on bathroom walls. Some restaurants threw away my dishes. My school locker was vandalized inside, and folders were marked fag and other obscenities. I was labeled a troublemaker, my mom an unfit mother, and I was not welcome anywhere. People would get up and leave so they would not have to sit anywhere near me. Even at church, people would not shake my hand. In 1987, my family and I decided to move. For the first time in 3 years, we feel we have a home, a supportive school, and lots of friends. I'm just one of the kids, and all because the students at Hamilton Heights High School listened to the facts, educated their parents and themselves, and believed in me." End of the quote. Ryan White is a citizen of the United States, and the problem he described occurred here. It is not unique, however. Ryan White is a citizen of the world, as are we all. Discrimination in all its many forms is not unique to the United States. As we move forward in the global attack on AIDS, we must all do our part to assure that the problems Ryan White had to face will be no more than a distant memory. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. And now I have much pleasure in introducing Dr. Anthony Fauci, Director of the United States Public Health Services National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He also serves as Associate Director of the National Institute of Health for AIDS Research. After receiving his MD degree from Cornell University Medical College and completing his postdoctoral training at that university's medical center in New York, Dr. Fauci joined NIAID in 1968. He was named its director in 1984. In addition to his many contributions in other areas of basic and clinical biomedical research, Dr. Fauci has been widely recognized for having demonstrated the precise nature of the immune defect in AIDS and has been instrumental in developing strategies for the treatment and immune reconstitution of AIDS patients. Dr. Fauci?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you this morning. What I would like to do in the 15 minutes that I have is to take a look at a number of areas regarding AIDS and what we might expect in the 1990s. If I could have the first slide, please. They're listed here on this slide, which you may not be able to see because of the lights, but I'll try to go through it. Obviously, there are a number of areas here, so I won't have time to go into any great detail on all of them, but I just want to touch on them and to point out one or two things that we can expect to see in the 1990s. Everything relating from the basic biomedical research budget up through and including I'm being ambushed here. I'm really a good guy, you know. Up through and including the changing face of the epidemic, the biomedical research, treatment, access to therapy, and vaccines. I will do this from the standpoint of a biomedical researcher. Obviously, everyone has their own perspective with which they look at things, and I'd like to give you my perspective as an individual involved in the basic biomedical research. For one thing, in the 1990s with regard to budget, the realities of the situation are that we cannot expect the kind of exponential growth in resources to support the biomedical research effort that we have seen in the decade of the 80s. As shown on this slide, looking from 1982 through 1990, there has been literally an exponential growth of our budget from $3 million in 1982 up to approximately $750 million in 1990. And the reason for this is that there are competing forces for resources of biomedical research. If you look at the institute that I direct, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, 48% of everything we do is AIDS. Now, many of you are familiar with our institute. We're responsible for all of immunology, allergy, asthma, transplantation, childhood and adult vaccination, a variety of infectious diseases of all types, tropical medicines, including tropical diseases, including malaria, schistosomiasis, and filariasis. And yet, 50% of everything we do is AIDS. I believe as a researcher that that's appropriate, but as we can see, the kind of growth that we've had with AIDS resources cannot keep up. A look at this slide will tell you what the rest of the American public sees when they see this type of resources allocation. In cancer in 1989, we spent $1.5 billion and approximately 500,000 people died of cancer. We spent $1 billion in heart disease, 777,000 died of heart disease. We spent $1.3 billion in AIDS, and 34,000 people died of AIDS. So there's a great disproportion there. I believe the resources are appropriately distributed because of the fact that we're dealing with an epidemic that is not under control. But as you might imagine, this is something that cannot last. So I'll only leave you with, we must continue to put our resources into this and to realize that we do not have something that is under control. You heard from Dr. Allen about the changing face of the epidemic. This will have influence on the kinds of things we can do from a biomedical research standpoint in the 1990s. And by the changing face of the epidemic, we mean, as seen here, over 110,000 individuals in this country have full-blown AIDS, with a breakdown in demography that has remained relatively consistent when you look at the entire picture over 7 or 8 years. About 61% gay and bisexual men, about 17% or so IV drug abusers, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at what's happened in the last 6 months, in the last year, in the last 3 years, we're seeing a gradual shift where individuals whose main risk is homosexual or bisexual activity, here you have a drop from 66 to 57, whereas there are an increase in IV drug abusers. What we have in this country are two epidemics. We have an epidemic of infection and an epidemic of disease. They're separated by 8 to 10 years. The epidemic of infection that occurred 10 and 8 years ago is now translated into an epidemic of disease. The epidemic of infection that's occurring now will be the epidemic of disease 7, 8, and 9 years from now. So what we're seeing, as pointed out appropriately by Dr. Allen, is a gradual shift of the epicenters of the problem to the major cities, predominantly in minority populations. This is being translated into cases in pediatrics, as seen here, approximately 2,000 cases, 81% of which are children whose mothers either had AIDS or HIV infection and was in a risk category almost exclusively having sex with an individual who was HIV infected, usually IV drug users. If one looks at the pediatric problem in a city like New York, a sophisticated city like New York City, you see here in a survey of about 20,000 infants in the state, 1 in 61 in the city were positive, and as many as 1 in 43 were positive in the Bronx, getting less and less as you go into boroughs with less of an IV drug use problem. So IV drug use is not only an important factor for the individuals infected, their sexual partners, and the children born of the union of those individuals. This is also seen in cities literally 40 miles north of here, and even in this city here in Washington, D.C. In a study we did in Baltimore, 5,000 patients who went into a sexually transmitted disease clinic, 5% of them were infected with HIV. But the frightening thing about it, that of the individuals less than 25 years old, 46% of the men had no other risk except heterosexual activity, and 72% of the women had no other risk besides heterosexual activity. So although these epicenters are now in the cities that you've heard about from Dr. Allen, the fact remains that there will be and is secondary and tertiary spread, something that we are going to see a lot more of in the 90s. What about biomedical research? In the areas of biomedical research, there have been enormous advances over the past decade. We don't have the time this morning to go into projections of these advances for the 90s, but certainly we can expect the decade of the 90s to be a decade of even more exciting advances, particularly in the area of therapy and vaccine development, which I will get to in one moment. What about treatment of HIV infection? It is very clear now that there are drugs, more than one, that are capable of suppressing HIV, and in doing so, preventing the progression of disease for at least a limited period of time and delaying the onset of symptoms and disease in others. You've all heard of AZT, azidothymidine, and the fact that it is used in individuals with full-blown AIDS and can prolong life in a meaningful way. The theme of the 1990s will be early intervention. These are a list of the drugs that are in clinical trial in the National Institutes of Health Drug Treatment Program, our AIDS clinical trial group. There are several of these on that list that will be used alone or in combination in the 90s. We're in the process of clinical trials to determine this. I said that the theme of the 90s will be early intervention. What do we mean by that? We mean treating individuals before they developed far advanced disease. And a number of studies just this past year in 1989 have indicated to us that this is feasible. One of these is the use of prophylaxis against certain infections, such as pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. We did a prospective study in approximately 5,000 men that we were following, gay men who were HIV infected, and we found out that if an individual's T4 count was less than 200 and they were completely asymptomatic, no symptoms at all, they had approximately a 15% chance of developing pneumocystis pneumonia. If they had one symptom, they had a 36% chance. If they had two symptoms, almost a 50% chance. Therefore, the recommendation of prophylaxis against pneumocystis has resulted already in 1989 in a substantial decrease in the rate of pneumocystis pneumonia in these individuals. 2 studies this summer looking at the effect of AZT versus placebo in individuals who have T4 cells of less than 500 and 1 or 2 symptoms showed clear-cut benefit, and even in individuals who didn't have any symptoms. Here on this slide showing there's twice as good a chance of progressing to ARC or AIDS if you were on placebo than if you were on AZT. I don't know if the drug is going to be AZT. It may be another drug or a combination of drugs. But getting to individuals before they progress to full-blown disease is something we must strive for in the 1990s. Of course, there are now clear-cut benefits of knowing whether someone is positive for the virus. We have to approach that with the thought in mind that we must eliminate the impediments to people for getting tested. We must make sure that testing is synonymous with counseling, it's synonymous with confidentiality, and it's synonymous with the protection and the preservation of individuals' personal and civil rights. When we do that, we have this to offer these individuals. We have a number of drugs, we have counseling, we have prophylaxis against opportunistic infections, such as TB, which is becoming a great problem in HIV-infected individuals. The problem of access to experimental therapy has been the source of a great deal of concern and activity here in the United States, because when you have a disease in which the only access to therapy might be a clinical trial, we have to rethink our approach towards the clinical trial process. We must maintain the integrity of the clinical trials because that's the only way we're going to get answers, but we have to be flexible in the fact that individuals who cannot be in the clinical trials must have some access to experimental drugs. This brings up a number of problems, namely the fact that we are dealing with a situation where we must delicately balance science against the humanitarian approach to HIV-infected individuals. We've done this, and this is just a start, by starting community programs, such as we have at the NIH, where we do clinical trials at the grassroots community level, in addition to the secondary and tertiary medical center approach that has been the classical approach for clinical trials. Also, some of you may have heard about the parallel track process, which the Public Health Service is right now in the process of putting the final touches on before implementation. And that is making drug available to individuals who have no other choice, who cannot be on a clinical trial at a time when, in fact, the drug is being tested to determine safety and efficacy after a phase 1 trial. We believe that this will be a successful program, and you'll be hearing a lot about it in the 1990s. Vaccine development, very briefly, a year or so ago, there was great pessimism about vaccine development. We still are a long way from a safe and effective vaccine. We're only in phase 1 trials in a number of vaccines. But some very interesting developments have occurred this past summer, and that is there has been the demonstration for the first time in an animal model of the feasibility of protective immunity. I refer to the immunization with whole kill virus of the simian immunodeficiency type to monkeys, and then challenging them with live virus and demonstrating that, in fact, you could, in some monkeys, prevent infection, and in others, not prevent infection, but delay the onset of disease. I think this is going to be rapidly translated into the 90s in human studies, and hopefully by the end of the decade, and perhaps within the decade of the 90s, we may have, if not a vaccine available, certainly well on our way in vaccine evaluation. And finally, there are certain critical public health issues related to HIV that are unique to HIV and has had researchers face problems that we've never had to face with any other diseases. And those are areas which interdigitate with what we do as researchers. The whole area of substance abuse, the great importance of sexually transmitted diseases, which we always realized were of great importance, which are now really assuming a more important role in this process. The reemergence of tuberculosis, the attention we have to pay now to maternal and child health care, the mental health and social services, education, and how the health care delivery system must be adjusted to a problem that we will face in the 90s that will be insurmountable if we do not realize that we have a very serious problem. So in summary then, I very briefly touched upon a number of issues which will be serious considerations for the 90s. What we can hope for is that we will continue to make the kinds of advances that we have seen in the 1980s. But we must approach it with all our research expertise, our management expertise, and above all, with compassion, which is deserving of HIV-infected individuals. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci. Our next speaker is Dr. June Osborne, Chair of the U.S. National Commission of AIDS and Dean of the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. Dr. Osborne took her medical training at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland and her specialty training in pediatrics at Children's and Massachusetts General Hospitals in Boston. Thereafter, she was a pediatrics research fellow at the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore and at the University of Pittsburgh. From 1966 to 1984, she was professor of medical microbiology and pediatrics at the University of Wisconsin Medical School. She assumed her present deanship and also professorships of epidemiology and pediatrics and communicable diseases at the University of Michigan in 1984. Dr. Osborne, it is a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate this morning. Coincident with this Second World AIDS Day, the imminence of the next decade is on our minds, and perhaps a glimpse of the year 2000 is in order. I'm not much of a futurist, and the charge to anticipate vistas of the year 2000 has caused me considerable unease in the past. It still does, but the peculiar traits of the human immunodeficiency virus make it unpleasantly easy to offer some predictions. As our insight sharpens, the median interval between onset of infection and advent of AIDS keeps growing longer, and recently it's become clear that the likely interval is 10 or even 11 years. Since that is a median interval, there will be many people who take longer to become ill. Indeed, there is good news from the AZT front that suggests that we may be able to extend the duration of asymptomatic HIV infection even further. And if all of that is true, we aren't really being futurists when we discuss people who will be caught up in the epidemic by the year 2000. In point of fact, we are talking about people who became infected last week. Of course, there's not as much information as one would like, ideally, to tell us how many of them there are. We have only general descriptive clues about who they are. On the positive side, we have the knowledge that might allow us to stop further spread next week, which surely would help matters. But what we know and can surmise warrants our collective anxiety that a decade may be barely enough time to prepare for the storm that glowers over the landscape of our societies. AIDS is a photograph, a snapshot that takes at least 10 years to develop, and dark clouds already dominate the mood of the picture that has now been taken. I want to spend just a few minutes today to talk about cultural, social, and political features of the epidemic. I will focus my remarks on the United States, since I know it best, but I want to point out that we serve usefully, if not admirably, always as a source of examples for countries around the world that are caught up in the same pandemic crisis, for we are reaping the whirlwind of our multicultural experiment. America was, of course, conceived as a haven for cultural diversity and was so brash a century ago as to reiterate its welcome to tired, poor, and huddled masses. They came, and most of them prospered, but not all. More recently, it has become even more complex, only now the dynamics are those of boat people or refugees or so-called illegal aliens. By these various routes, the experiences of America's people with HIV and AIDS are as diverse as humanity itself, and it has been the epicenter, the trailblazer in epidemic experience. Culturally, it's become unfashionable, even unwise, to refer to American society as a melting pot, for cultures don't melt. Persons whose exploration of their roots unearth the tangled traces of slavery are just beginning to dig further to find taproots of a sustaining ethos. Better preserved and defined cultural identities are cherished by many of the peoples who contribute distinctively to our population. Well-meaning Anglos are learning that sensitivity to one sort of Hispanic background may not serve well in sensing the feelings of another, and Americans whose personal histories trace far back into ancient Chinese or Japanese cultures find their collective grouping as Asian Americans to be startlingly superficial. Indeed, we stand to benefit greatly if we can learn to celebrate our diversity, but in the meantime there is serious social trouble, for some of the immiscible elements of our multicultural population are sinking into a morass of poverty, illiteracy, hopelessness, and heightened risk of drugs and HIV, and the extent to which that continues will go far to describe AIDS in the year 2000. It is approximately that year that the so-called majority will become the minority in America. What else can we say about the place of HIV in the social landscape of 2000? Well, there will be no further argument about whether AIDS is a disease of restricted groups. We will know that it is a sexually transmitted disease to which men, women, and above all adolescents are susceptible and vulnerable. The apparent variations in efficiency of transmission that have received so much attention in the American press will long since have scattered like straw men before the fact that with sexual activity, inefficiency doesn't matter, since the behavior is so prevalent. Any kind of sexual intercourse seems to work when it comes to transmitting HIV, and so the focus will have turned appropriately to numbers of sexual partners and to self-protection against the virus by use of condoms, spermicides, and other measures yet to be devised. As heterosexual spread becomes increasingly dominant, there will of course be greatly increased representation of women among the HIV infected, and as surely as night follows day, there will be children. That is certain to force a rather dramatic shift in the dynamics of health care and social welfare in those epidemic areas of our country where the initial preponderance of gay men masked the true universality of the virus. The dominance of men among the HIV afflicted had been so striking in some areas of the U.S., the West Coast and parts of the South, for instance, that when the first wave of bisexually transmitted cases appeared, it had impact out of all proportion to their numbers. Single adult men are challenge enough, but when illness and death pervade a whole multi-generational family unit, it is a far different matter, and that is what's coming. In parts of the U.S. where the virus has been present the longest, the male-to-female ratio is approaching 1-to-1. The AIDS snapshot is already in the developer, and last year, as you just saw, in one study, 1 in every 61 births in New York was to an HIV-infected mother. Where there are 2 parents in such a household, 1 or both may be ill, and employment-related health insurance becomes a frail source of care as chronic disease manifestations emerge. As often as not, there is only 1 parent, the index case, already so ill that she can no longer function as a caregiver, much less as a provider. New York is the scene of some horrendous vignettes. Older children, unaffected because their birth order preceded maternal infection, have been left standing like lone surviving trees in a burned-out forest after parents and younger siblings have sickened and died. There are not many such children yet, but there are enough to warn, and it is a specter to be conjured with in the future. Already we're groping for new terms to serve as synonyms for orphanage, since the archaicism of that kind of institution is hard for us to accept, despite the growing need. Of course, all that means that there will be infected infants, too, and pediatric AIDS is a horror that defies imagination. Anyone who has delighted at first hand in the miraculous flowering of neurologic skills in a healthy infant must recoil at the very concept that developmental milestones once attained might yet be reversed and recede. The tortuous illness and death of a child must rank with the most profound of grievous losses. Yet by the end of the next 2 years in our country, AIDS will begin to match annually the toll formerly exacted on children by congenital rubella. But neurologic and systemic disease of children is not the only harm. In our experience in the United States, even when the children born to an HIV-infected mother have escaped infection themselves, they may be doomed to stigma, for the social ramifications of participation in this epidemic, however indirect, have such force that an awful fraction of the 65,000 families in our country thus far suffering losses from AIDS have had to do even their grieving in secret. What a horror, and what a future to offer a child. I do not know how to avoid completely the occurrence of pediatric AIDS in the year 2000, for that is horrid graffiti that may already have been carved in stone. But at the very least, we must protect those children from the ravages and pervasive costs of unwarranted fear. The toll in our children could be horrendous. and it will sweep up with special fury those who are now disadvantaged adolescents and children, especially those for whom the odds in life's game are so bad already that a 50-50 chance sounds like the best hand they've ever been dealt, when the downside relates to obscure events a few years hence. We must learn much about such children that we do not presently know in order to intercept the virus along this pathway, and we will have to use sensitivity to communicate with people within those desperate communities if they and we are to have a chance of interrupting the inexorable spread of HIV. Let me make a few more comments about culture and then a few about politics. We must take special care to assign to cultural diversity its proper place as this epidemic progresses, or the road taken to the year 2000 could be not only grim but bleak. I don't care to predict the outcome, for the anticipation depends on my mood. Instead, I will simply focus for a moment on some of the vector forces that will determine the ultimate direction. Repressive reactions to AIDS have already been notable for their ability to distract the public from more useful efforts. It seems far easier to think about cordoning off peripheral segments of the population than to face squarely the implications of the facts of limited transmission and their correlative message about the need for behavior change. But the outcome of such simplistic thinking is not trivial, and it sometimes takes much more pernicious forms. That mentality cordons off HIV-positive persons in Cuba. It threatens the testing of international travelers before entry into a country, even without commensurate attention to returning nationals. It creates barriers to human commerce and cultural exchange, and blights even our rational approach to matters such as workplace safety. Sometimes politicians complain that we're making an awful fuss over just one disease and that we are distorting priorities in the process. But it's terribly important to realize that the only thing really new about AIDS is the virus and the awful diseases it provokes. All the rest of the problems with which we are grappling constitute familiar turf revisited. And perhaps we can devise fresh approaches to practical problems and can learn better ways to celebrate the diversity of humanity as we struggle together against the virus enemy. I have been personally intrigued with the discovery that there are so many cross-cutting universals. The more divergent a culture is from my own, the more I am struck by the common chords to which the human family resonates. For instance, love of children is universal, as is some form of the perception that they embody our hopes for immortality. What differs is how readily we may sometimes forget that we feel that way. And there, I think the so-called developed cultures might profit from the experience of other less cluttered societies. We are also prone to forget that others feel at least as strongly about their children as we do about ours, resulting, for instance, in blithe assumptions and blind fiats that an HIV-infected woman should never get pregnant, as if that were sufficient to settle the matter. In this epidemic, it has been intriguing to watch public figures hug small children with AIDS in their effort to convey understanding and compassion. As I watch, I have pondered about what is the statute of limitations on childhood. When do we begin to revoke the permit for potential childishness and imperfection that stays with us nevertheless, lifelong? The need for dignity is another feature that I think is absolutely universal, and in proportion to the extent that it is given or taken away, so waxes or wanes our capacity to help, and especially to educate. A stranger who strips away one's dignity at the very outset surely cannot safely be considered a friend. As we design interventions for health care and social support of persons who are progressively hampered by this awful virus and its diseases, the very feasibility of our innovations will rest on the remembrance of dignity as a determinant force. Loyalty to loved ones is a complex and interesting universal. It can inspire wonderful feats of human courage and endurance, but it is also a force that drives men to war and causes people to lie, cheat, and steal. In fact, it is protean in its perversions, but nevertheless too strong to forget in our planning. I was fascinated by a complaint registered recently by a colleague from a country in which frequent patronization of female prostitutes was a cultural force to be reckoned with. He noted with some despair that seropositive men were willing to follow through with partner notification when it came to extramarital partners, and yet refused to notify their wives. How complicated that is, and yet we must not underestimate or fail to learn the meaning of the powerful twisted loyalties that are expressed in such a quixotic distinction if we are going to be able to deploy our knowledge to stop this epidemic. The challenges grow more difficult all the time. The restricted patterns of transmission allow the virus to thrive in a medium of alcohol excess or drug-obscured judgment. The epidemic is swelling the growing army of the destitute, adding progressive neurologic deterioration to the appalling mix of chronic alcoholism, chronic mental illness, homelessness, and helplessness. And it seems to fuel a right-wing flare which in turn nourishes a public taste for conspiracy and serves as a convenient substitute for common sense and hard work. Common sense would tell us that authoritarian approaches have never served well to govern human sexual behavior, that drug use is flourishing in the face of pre-existing legal sanctions, and that voluntary change in personal and private risky behavior is what is needed to stop the spread of the AIDS virus. But the ideologues imply with their categorical solutions that such change can be accomplished by fiat and decree. We must resist that. We are not alone with this problem. It's a global problem and will never again be gone. The world changed with the appearance of the virus of AIDS. A new microbiological bomb has been detonated in our midst, and like the advent of Hiroshima, the human immunodeficiency virus is a fact of life now for the whole human family. We must learn to deal with it for the sake of our children's children. I very much like a quotation from Camus' The Plague that must by now have become almost tiresomely familiar to toilers in the field of AIDS, but it serves well here. The conclusion of the doctor that what we learn in time of pestilence is that there are more things to admire in men than to despise. The first years of the AIDS epidemic have underscored that, and the shadows of grief have been relieved by flashes of great humanity. It is the fate of many generations never to recognize greatness in their midst, or to do so only vaguely. By contrast, we have had the privilege of knowing in the thick of social battle that we are in the company of heroes of our time. My friend Jonathan Mann, director of the Global Program on AIDS with the World Health Organization, is a wonderful case in point, and there are a number of others here today. And the common themes of myriad cultures give us new ways to learn to admire and not despise. I am an inveterate optimist, and so you will forgive me if I conclude that way. The counterpoint of that heroism assures that the landscape of 2000 will not be desolate, that the dreadful AIDS snapshot already taken could turn out to be the ugliest of them, the tragic denouement of a rigorous 20th century lesson in hubris and humility. At least there is a lot to be done, and perhaps, just barely, enough time to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Osborne, for those wonderful remarks. AIDS in Latin America and the Caribbean is, of course, a pressing concern here at the Pan American Health Organization. To describe the AIDS situation in the Americas and what the organization is doing about it, I am pleased to present Dr. Fernando Zacarias, PAHO Senior Advisor on AIDS and Sexually Transmitted Disease. Dr. Zacarias obtained his medical degree from the National Autonomous University of Mexico and became a specialist in infectious diseases and preventive medicine in the United States. He also holds a doctorate in public health from Harvard University and has extensive experience working in STD control in North America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Dr. Zacarias has been a visiting scientist at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta and has worked for PAHO for 5 years. He has spent the last 2.5 years here in PAHO AIDS program, which he has very ably headed for the past several months. As you know, his devotion to the program is beyond question. And now I give you Dr. Zacarias.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bond, Dr. Macedo, distinguished speakers and guests, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. The epidemic of AIDS and HIV infection is now truly global in nature. 1 month ago, 187,000 cases of AIDS had been reported to the World Health Organization from 152 of the more than 170 countries and territories that compose the world community. In today's update, the total being released from WHO headquarters in Geneva will approximate 200,000 cases. But the estimates by the Global Program on AIDS are that these figures underrepresent the problem and that probably more than 600,000 of cases of AIDS have already occurred in the world as of today. The first slide, please. No, the previous one, please. I would like to update the figures for the region of the Americas. As of November 30th, in the Western Hemisphere, all the countries and territories in the region of the Americas had reported a total of 135,199 AIDS cases, with 76,015 deaths. To update the figures for North America, Canada, and the United States, Canada had reported 3,288, and the United States 112,000. There are copies of the statistics outside in one of the desks. What I would like to point out is the rapid increase in the reporting of cases. For example, in the case of Mexico, the total now is 2,683. The Central American Isthmus, the 5 Central American republics, and Panama have reported 912. The 5 Andean countries have reported a total of 1,512. The 4 countries of the southern cone of South America, 752. The Latin Caribbean, which includes Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, 3,478, and the English-speaking Caribbean, 1,812. The important point is that although we have the absolute number of cases, the distribution of the cases is not the same, and the distribution in relation to the populations of the countries is not equal. Some of the smaller territories and islands in the Caribbean have an inordinate amount of cases in relationship to their populations. The other point that I would like to make is that the spread of the epidemic has been quite similar in North America, Latin America, and in the Caribbean. The only difference has been the recognition in time of the initial notification or discovery of cases. Another reminder is that in the Americas, as in everywhere in the world, there are only 3 ways in which the HIV, the AIDS virus, is being transmitted: through sexual transmission between 2 men, a man and a woman, or a woman and a man, through blood products, contaminated syringes, needles, and other instruments, and also organs and transplants, and perinatally from an infected mother to a child. On that basis, the World Health Organization had divided the spread of the epidemic and the situation in the different countries in 3 patterns. Pattern 1, in which predominantly what we see is a homosexual, bisexual transmission among persons who abuse IV drugs and their partners, and situations in which there are high rates of infection among individuals with those kinds of behaviors. Pattern 2, in which the transmission is predominantly heterosexual. An equal number of men and women are infected. Unfortunately, in many of these areas, blood and blood products are still a significant part of the transmission. And as a consequence of the infection in women, there's infection in children, which is associated to the maternal infection or to blood transfusion. And finally, pattern 3, which includes those countries in which the HIV, the AIDS virus, has only recently been introduced. In the next slide, I show you very briefly the situation in the Americas, in which we have basically a mosaic of the 3 patterns. Pattern 1 countries are depicted here as the United States, Canada, Chile, and Bolivia, in which the pattern of transmission is according to the pattern described previously. But you see an increasing number of countries such as Dominican Republic, Trinidad and Tobago, Honduras, and the Bahamas, in which in green you can see that the increase in heterosexual transmission that we are seeing. What this tells us is what other speakers have previously alluded to, and is that we in the Americas started seeing problems of transmission among two men, then transmission of a bisexual man to women, and then here you have a woman who has had sex with three men, another woman here, and we are beginning to see transmission to children. In some smaller countries, 17 to 18% of cases are being reported in persons younger than 15. And although perinatal transmission, the proportion is still low, in some countries it's 1 to 2% of all AIDS cases. Here are some examples from some countries, the statistics reported to the Pan American Health Organization. And for example, in the case of Brazil, you can see that 2/3 of the cases are still associated to bisexual or homosexual transmission. But we see that an increasing number of cases are being transmitted heterosexually. And another thing that is important is that the problem of IV drug use that 5 years, 6 years ago was not recognized as a significant factor in Latin America is increasingly being reported by our countries. Another example will be Bermuda, in which what I would like to point out is that the cases reported to us, almost 50% have been associated to IV drug abuse. And finally, another example of a country in the Central American Isthmus in which 1/4 of the cases are associated to heterosexual transmission. And also point out 16% to IV drug use. So we are learning from bitter experience, and we have to change the approaches to the problem. The other points that I wanted to make is that the AIDS cases represent the final or the terminal, the full-blown form of the HIV infection. And here you see a patient in Haiti coming to the hospital with a terminal form of the disease. Here you see another patient. I don't think you can clearly see that. It's a patient in another hospital in Latin America having neurological manifestations of the disease. This is something that is also increasing and is being seen by our clinicians in the countries. And another manifestation of disease in another hospital. These are the cases reported to us, people who are already sick. What I would like to point out and to underscore the presentations by Dr. Fauci, Dr. Allen, Dr. Osborne, and the speakers who preceded me, is that the challenge that we face in the Americas is the challenge being faced by all countries in the world. What to do with people who are at risk so that they don't get exposed to the HIV, the AIDS virus, they don't get the infection, and then this infection does not progress to overt disease, the AIDS cases, and especially what to do so that transmission does not occur for those infected individuals to the population at risk. And finally, what can we do so that the overt disease, the AIDS, does not progress into death, so that we can prolong survival and in some cases maybe talk about the possibility of cure. Now, unfortunately, what we have learned from studies on the natural history of the disease, and this is a study from San Francisco, we know that people infected at this moment in a few years, approximately 50% of them will go on to develop the full-blown manifestation of disease, AIDS cases. And this is a period that will take from 7 to 10 years. And a significant number of them will also develop other symptoms of HIV infection. From studies in several countries in the Americas, we know that there are people who are already infected. Dr. Allen referred to an estimate in the United States of about 1 million people already infected. As a whole, for the region of the Americas, we estimate that maybe 2 million people may be already infected in our region. And this is a slide that depicts some of the studies that have been done in people who donate blood. And in the last figure, you can see the percent of infected people. Of course, these are not scientific studies, are people who have sought to donate blood in several centers. But you can see that the ranges go from 4 in 10,000 in one initial study in Argentina to as high as 7.3% in one small group of blood donors in one country, in Mexico, several years ago. So that means that the problem is already in some sectors of the population. At the global level, the estimates of people already infected with the AIDS virus at this moment are larger than 5 million. And here we have the distribution according to the patterns. Pattern 1, remember, homosexual, bisexual transmission and IV drug abuse. Pattern 2, transmission among men and women, and the estimates are about 2.5 million for each. And finally, pattern 3, those countries with recent introduction, 10,000 people infected. What I would like to point out is the male to female ratios that in the two last patterns are 1:1, and in pattern 1 still about 9 men infected for each woman infected. But look at the last column, the estimated numbers of women who are already infected in the world and the consequences that that will have for future generations. The total 1.5 million. Now, this is another figure. It's called a Delphi projection, and it's a best guess, an educated guess by experts as to what could happen. And in this Delphi projection, the experts have predicted that even at this moment, with the numbers of people estimated infected, by the year 2000, it is quite possible that we may have up to 5 or 6 million people with AIDS. And if we don't do anything, maybe 16, 18 million people will be infected with the AIDS virus. Now, you cannot see that clearly, but in the year 2000, this is the way the world will look as far as AIDS cases and HIV infection. All the countries and territories will have the problem of AIDS. And the point that we wanted to make, again, is that the epidemic of AIDS and HIV infection is now global in nature. It's not a problem that we can pinpoint to one country, to one region, to one group of people, so that everybody should be concerned about that. The second point that I wanted to make is that the AIDS problem is unequally distributed, that even within one country you may have more cases in one sector of the population, in one geographic area, and that is important to take into account. The third point is that the epidemic is changing, as we have seen in the Americas, where initially we had a pattern 1, and very rapidly we are changing to a pattern 2 of infection in women and children. And finally, that the problem will get worse before it can get any better. This brings us to the area of control. And again, Dr. Fauci had already mentioned some of the interventions with ACT and some of the drugs that initially were tried on people who had already the overt disease, AIDS cases, in order to slow the progression of the disease. They are talking about the trials to avoid that people who are already infected progress to the manifestations of AIDS and overt disease, preventing opportunistic infections, for example. We are talking about the possibility of developing a vaccine that will prevent that exposed people will get infected. But we should continue talking for the time being, or for many decades to come, of how to avoid that people at risk get exposed to the HIV virus. The other point that I wanted to make is that there is hope. We have some examples in the health field of successes, and one of them is the following. In the decade of the 40s and the 50s, people who got poliomyelitis, some of them developed a form of respiratory paralysis and have to be put in these kinds of machines, very expensive, high-cost equipment, and that was the only hope. Well, a vaccine was developed, and all this technology and the cost associated to that became obsolete. Another triumph that we can talk about is the eradication from the world of smallpox, also thanks to vaccine. In the case of AIDS, of course, we still don't have the vaccine, we still don't have a cure. We have information as a first step, and we have the capacity of education at all levels to try to make people take responsibility and change behaviors. And finally, the point that I would like to make is that AIDS is a big health problem. Dr. Fauci alluded to 50% of the budget being dedicated to AIDS research, while the AIDS programs in the countries are competing against, if we may say so, against other health programs because the resources are scarce. And health sector is competing against other social activities and other social programs. And within the context of the countries, the health and social services are, of course, competing against other sectors of the economy and other expenditures by the governments and by the private community. And I would like to end up by showing you a slide that I don't know if you can read very well. This is from an editorial from the Canadian Journal of Public Health, in which they talk about the social and military progress in the world and the progress that has been achieved since 1945. In the first place, literacy and per capita income in a worldwide basis has doubled in that period of 45 years. In the same period, the power of conventional weapons, we're not talking about nuclear weapons, has increased 24 times, and their capacity to kill about 200 times. At the global level, each soldier costs $26,500, and the education of a child, $450. That includes the teacher, the school, the nourishment for the child, etc., etc. And finally, the third point is that $152 per capita in the world are used for military expenditures and only 6 cents to promote peace. Of course, the statistics can be updated and can be adapted to each one of the regions. May I have the lights on, please? I believe that it is appropriate in the context of the World AIDS Day to ask ourselves and our young people, what do we want and what do they want? After all, we and they will have to live with AIDS and its consequences for decades to come. In a world of scarcity or maldistribution of resources and plenty of needs, those of us who work in health, those of us who work for health, must remember that choices will have to be made and that we must participate in those choices. We must remember that although we are ready to join the battle against disease and death, that although we are willing to fight for health and quality of life, deep down in our inner core, we must remember that we are, and we should be, men and women of peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Zacharias. Just as the AIDS problem has been growing by leaps and bounds in Latin America, so has it here in the United States among people of Latin American descent. The several hundred agencies dealing with health problems in the United States Hispanic community are naturally and they coordinate their efforts against the disease through the National Coalition of Hispanic Health and Human Services Organizations, whose president, Dr. Jane Delgado, is with us today. Dr. Delgado, who received her doctorate in clinical psychology at the State University of New York at Stony Brook and still practices that discipline, worked from 1979 to 1985 in senior positions in the Offices of Human Development Services and of Community Services in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and lastly, as a health policy advisor in the office of the Secretary of that department. She assumed her present position as President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Coalition in 1985. Dr. Delgado, we are pleased to have you with us today.
I am pleased to be here. I am not going to be as calm a speaker as my predecessors, only because while we speak today on World AIDS Day, more Hispanics are dying in the United States of AIDS. My organization represents the 22 million Hispanics who live in the United States. That makes us the 5th largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. And contrary to what many people think, 72% of those Hispanics were either born in the United States or have been here for many generations. As many of you know, North America was under Spanish rule for many centuries before it became ruled under the United States flag. Anyway, one of the things that concerns us about AIDS is the myths and the facts. Many of you picked up this booklet outside. When I came to my organization in 1985, I came from the Department of Health and Human Services, where I already knew that AIDS was a major problem for our communities. The media in the United States has recently begun to say, oh, well, this is a new problem. All of a sudden, Hispanics are being affected by this disease. But that is not the case. And what we did is we presented a booklet that has myths and facts. One of the major myths is that AIDS is new to our community. In fact, since 1981, Hispanics have been overrepresented as a percentage of AIDS cases in the United States. Today, we have 16,000 persons who are Hispanic who have AIDS in the United States. That 16,000 represents 17% of the people who have AIDS in the United States. We are only 8% of the population. So when we talk about AIDS in the United States, we're talking about a crisis which is very large. And for my organization, our mission goes beyond AIDS. It includes all health and human services. But we recognize that AIDS provides a way for us to look at all the cracks and crevices that exist in providing services to people of Hispanic origin in the United States. We also recognize that the high fatality rate and the lack of coordination of services makes it important for us to get out to our communities and take risks as leaders. It's amazing that one can be at an AIDS conference this long and never hear the word condom mentioned. In this age, that becomes very important. As leaders, we must take those risks and talk about these things and the importance of dissemination of this information to all our people. I must admit, it does not win you popularity points, but it does save lives. What are the kinds of things which we are trying to do? One of the things we're trying to do is trying to get education out to people. In this booklet, we talk about myths and facts, but we also talk about things that need to be done in the area of education, services, research, and policy. Critical areas for our people. In education, we need information in health promotion and disease prevention. For our young people in the United States, one of the problems that we as Hispanics suffer from is the fact that we do not talk about sexuality the way that mainstream America does. So if we're going to have programs targeted to our families and our young people, they have to be within a cultural context which is acceptable to our families and our young people. We may be Americans by birth or by circumstance, but the fact is that our values are very traditional Hispanic, and we believe very much in the empowerment of the family and having the family do these activities. So we talk about education about AIDS to young people. We talk about education about AIDS to health professionals. Those are things we have to get going. In the area of services, our organization is at the forefront of trying to get more funds and services to Hispanics. And the idea of trying to be bilingual and bicultural and accepting that cultural diversity that people talk about as an asset. I'm sure that many of you know that someone who is trilingual is called multilingual, or someone who speaks 3 languages is called multilingual, someone who speaks 2 languages is called bilingual, and someone who speaks 1 language is usually called an American. We try to make it so that bilingualism is seen as an asset, and we work hard at that. And in services, it's very important because while the young people may speak English, the parents or the grandparents may feel comfortable talking in Spanish, which means that if you're going to do an intervention, either about diet, medication, services, coordination between health and human services, you must be able to bridge that gap. My Spanish is not perfect, but I can communicate, and that's important. And more importantly, my concern is there. So we work very much with health professionals to get them there. The idea of research, lots is happening with early diagnosis and treatment. The numbers which were presented were very impressive. You look at NIH clinical trials and you try to see how many Hispanics are participating on those trials. Very few. We have never been a part of traditional healthcare in the United States. People like to say, well, Hispanics like folk medicine. Hispanics use folk medicine in the United States because that's all that's often been available to us. But now, in the era of AIDS, we have got to reach out to our communities and do more. We have got to get our people into treatment. When we think of AIDS on World AIDS Day, the important thing to think about is leadership. That's what it's all about. That's why all of you are here. You're all here because you're talking about something which in many places is still very unpopular. It is still difficult to talk about sexuality. It is still difficult to talk about substance abuse. We have found that in our communities it's much more acceptable to say that you have had contact with a prostitute or IV drug use rather than to say you have engaged in male-to-male contact. That means that when we get our data, when we develop our programs, that we may be developing information which is not accurate. Another thing in this booklet, which was a myth, was that the major transmission category for Hispanics was IV drug use. We found no, that's not true. We asked the Centers for Disease Control to do several runs of data for us. We found it was gay bisexual category of transmission. Very hard to sell to our community, but very important for us to take that risk in taking that information to them. Those are the kinds of things that we have to do. We have to do this in a way which is neither paternalistic or colonialism, because, ladies and gentlemen, you know that in health we can be paternalistic and colonial, or we can take a very liberal attitude and say, well, we know what to do for these people. We have to be at the forefront and let people tell us what they need done by us, and that's a different kind of leadership. We have to also not buy this thing of populations that are hard to reach. For me, as a Hispanic American, I always hear Hispanics are hard to reach with health messages, right? How come the tobacco industry has been so good at reaching our people about their message? That smoking is good, all right? Obviously, we have the tools. We are not using them all. That's where we have to take the next risk. Finally, understanding that traditional networks have not worked, it means getting out there and doing some of the things that we aren't trained to do. When I was trained as a psychologist, I was trained to work in an office. I had one professor who was considered not stable because he told us to go to home visits, go out to communities, visit the people, work with them. That's what we have to do. In AIDS education, AIDS prevention, we're talking about personal, private, difficult behaviors. To change, to acknowledge. And if we're going to take risks and change lives and save lives, we've got to be out there with the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Delgado. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Peter Bourne, formerly advisor on health at the White House, who on behalf of the American Association for American Association for World Health will present World AIDS Day Awards to 4 groups for their outstanding contributions to AIDS awareness. I would like to ask Dr. Macedo if you will please come forward to present the award as Dr. Bourne mentions the name of the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bourne, Dr. Macedo, other distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first of all just thank you all for being here today. I think it is really most encouraging that there is such an excellent turnout, and I really want to express my appreciation to you for being here. The American Association for World Health is proud to join PAHO and the Department of Health and Human Services in co-sponsoring World AIDS Day in the U.S. As most of you know, all across the country today, hundreds of thousands of people are participating in conferences, exhibitions, plays, symposiums, classroom events, and other observances, each sharing our common concern. You may be interested to know that tonight on ABC Nightly News there will be a special feature on World AIDS Day. We know that the control of AIDS requires a major mutual effort. It requires, as earlier speakers have said, an effort by each individual in every community, in every country throughout the world. AIDS is a deadly disease, and yet it restores in many ways our faith in each other, knowing how dependent we are on one another. In addition, in the absence of technology and any immediate scientific solution to the HIV problem, human interaction in the form of communication and education is our sole weapon against this epidemic. I think also one thing that AIDS has done for us is to renew our appreciation for PAHO and the World Health Organization. These unique organizations have provided an extraordinary example of the global coordination that will be necessary if we are to conquer this scourge. What I want to do now is to present the awards that we have decided to give to 4 organizations. I would like to say that these organizations are symbolic and representative of more than 12,000 groups around the country that are organizing World AIDS Day events today. So these are organizations that have done extraordinary work in their own right, but are still representative of an enormously larger number. The first of these organizations is the AIDS Activity Program of the Virginia State Department of Health. AIDS awareness in Virginia is symbolized by a statewide ringing of bells in churches and schools, one of many innovative activities the State Health Department has helped organize. I'd like to ask Catherine A. Havard, coordinator of the AIDS Activity Program, to accept the State Program Award. The second awardee is the American Red Cross for its outstanding support, which organized special mailings to more than 1,000 local chapters throughout the United States through its HIV/AIDS Education Office. The local chapters, in turn, have been organizing force for local events in the community. To accept the awards, I would like to ask Carol Hoffman, HIV/AIDS Education Office, and Jose Aponte, Director of the International Services at the National Headquarters, to come forward. More than 5,000 schools and school districts here in the U.S. are observing World AIDS Day in classroom activities. We particularly would like to recognize the Chicago public school system for a truly outstanding effort to coordinate World AIDS Day awareness programs in its 600 school system. Amy Isbell, a Chicago native and a member of the staff of Senator Paul Simon of Illinois, is here to accept the Chicago Award. Ms. Isbell? And our fourth group is from Philadelphia. A group of individuals representing the arts, gay and AIDS communities have organized a 4-day festival they call A Living Legacy, an arts festival on AIDS around World AIDS Day. The celebration includes performances and art exhibits throughout the city and features artists from New York and Washington as well as Philadelphia. We cite Our Living Legacy as a buoyant community group and commend its compassionate spirit and contribution to its community. Dwight Martin and David Collins are here to accept that award. That concludes the awards, and again, thank you for being here today.
For viewers who want to know more about C-SPAN, we publish a weekly newspaper called the C-SPAN Update. It's a useful companion to your C-SPAN viewing. In its 12 pages, you'll find stories about our public affairs programming, articles concerning the issues, events, and newsmakers we cover. There's information about the network and feedback from our viewers. Plus, a pull-out section with our general schedule, including airtimes for special programs we know about in advance. Just $24 brings you 50 issues of the C-SPAN Update. To place your order, call 1-800-346-8800. Use your credit card or we'll be glad to bill you. This week's update reports on C-SPAN's coverage of the Conservative Leadership Conference and a speech by CIA Director William Webster before the National Press Club. If you order the C-SPAN Update now, you'll also receive a free gift, Gavel to Gavel. It's a valuable guide to the televised proceedings of Congress. Call 1-800-346-8800 and we'll send you Gavel to Gavel and 50 issues of the C-SPAN Update, both for just $24. Call now.